In Douglas Adams' book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as a primary plot device, he uses a fictional book, a guidebook, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he states at the beginning that the first page of this book has in bright red letters the words, "Don't panic." As we look in our world today and we look at what's happening with the coronavirus and other issues, we see that there is a lot of panic going on. People are buying up just about everything they can get their hands on. They're buying toilet paper so that you can't find it, or they're buying up bottled water because apparently they are afraid that the that water is going to be shut off or something. The simple fact is panic is a primary problem going on right now. And it is a fearful time. But fear is nothing new. And fear should not be something that controls us. In Mark chapter 4, we have an interesting story about a time that the disciples feared. The story takes place early on in the ministry of Jesus, probably within the first few months of his earthly ministry. And beginning in verse number 35 of Mark 4, it says, "On that day, when the evening had come, he told them, 'Let's cross over to the other side of the sea.' So they left the crowd and took him along, since he was already in the boat, and other boats were with him. A fierce windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. So they woke him up and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care that we are going to die?' He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Silence, be still.' The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he said to them, 'Why are you fearful? Do you still have no faith?' And they were terrified and asked one another, 'Who is this? Even the wind and sea obey him.'" If you look kind of historically what was happening here, Jesus had been teaching from inside of the boat. There on the Sea of Galilee, this was actually a common tactic of his. He does it a number of times that's recorded in Scripture. And the reason why is there would be a lot of crowds that would gather, and the water served as a means of voice amplification. And so Jesus would get into this boat, they would go out a little bit, he would speak back to the shore, to the crowds on the shore, and they would all be able to hear him, as opposed if he had just been down there, they would have been crowding in, getting close to him, and their very presence of all the bodies would have disrupted the sound of his voice. But Jesus finishes teaching, it's late in the day, and he turns to the disciples, he says, "Let's go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Uh, we're already in the boat, just go." And it's important to note that there on the Sea of Galilee, the storm that came up that night, they're very common. It's a windstorm. The Sea of Galilee sits a little bit lower elevation, but surrounding it, there's a lot of hills, a lot of cliff sides, a lot of mountains, and as such it creates a wind tunnel effect there. It's kind of like if you go into downtown Fort Worth and you're walking through the tall skyscrapers, a small little breeze in downtown Fort Worth can feel like a pretty heavy wind, whereas if you immediately move from there into a wide open field, it feels like a small breeze. It's the wind tunnel effect. So if you get a strong windstorm that comes through on the Sea of Galilee, it can quickly become a major problem for boats that are on the sea, especially back then. And so those who are in the boat, you have some people like Peter and James and John who grew up as fishermen. They understood the sea. They would spend hours and hours and hours and days, and they'd spent years of their life on the sea. They understood boats. They understood the sea. And then you have other people like Matthew, who's a tax collector. He's not a fisherman. He doesn't spend time on the sea. He goes from house to house collecting taxes. And so you have these two very distinct groups of individuals who are in this boat with Jesus that night when the storm comes up. Now, for those who are inexperienced, the boat starts rocking, the waves start lashing, it becomes a very frightful experience for them, which is understandable because it's an unknown. They don't know what's going on, they're not familiar with this, they're in an uncomfortable situation. That's one of the great powers of fear, is it largely comes from the unknown. We don't know, therefore we fear. I remember when I was in Florida years ago at a youth camp, we were taking the kids out canoeing one day on this river there in Florida, not too far outside of Orlando. And while we were in the canoe, I was in there with the special speaker that we had that week at youth camp, and he grew up in Florida. He understood. He knew what Florida was like. For me, this is a brand new experience. Being from Nebraska, there was something in Florida that I had never seen up close and in person, and that's alligators. And so we get in this canoe with I'm in there with the special speaker, and I'm in the front of the canoe, he's in the back, and we're going down. There's kids in the other canoes around us, and there on the seashore, on the shore of the river, we see various alligators, and we get to this one point along the river, and I look over, and there's this really big alligator, probably about 10 to 12 feet long, and it's just there on the shore of the river, and we're not going down very fast, just kind of going with the current, and this alligator gets into the water, and it starts swimming in the water. It's still there at the top. It hasn't gone underneath the water, but it's where we can watch it, and it starts approaching my canoe. And it gets within just a few feet, and it immediately, very, very rapidly, spins and whips its tail so that it started shaking and rocking the canoe. I'm scared out of my mind because this is a big alligator, and I don't know anything about him. I'm not used to this behavior. It scares me to death. The special speaker told me afterwards that my eyes were huge and that I had a look of complete terror on my face. It's because I was unfamiliar. He told me that probably what had happened is that this alligator had been fed by people in times past, and it came out expecting it, and it kind of got a little aggressive because we didn't feed it. And that aspect is probably what's at play here with many of these disciples, is this storm comes up, and initially the storm comes up, the boat starts rocking, the wind starts blowing, waves start crashing up against the boat, and for those inexperienced, they're scared. But then you have your more experienced who know what they're doing. They start working the sails, they start manning the oars, and and they seem comfortable at first. But then the storm gets worse and worse and worse. And to the point to where even the most experienced in that boat, your James, your John, your Peters, they're terrified. They think that they're all going to die. And what do you think that does to the ones who are inexperienced? It just sends them into further panic. You see, here's what happens. Fear begins to feed on itself. It is a contagion, and it spreads, and it begins to feed on itself. To give you a recent illustration with the toilet paper issue that we're seeing, that and how difficult it is to find. The reason why is because you had a few people who got all panicked and thought, oh my word, this disease is going to kill us all, and I'm going to be stuck in my home, so I need to go and buy up as much toilet paper as I possibly can. Well, the next group of people says, well, if they get all the toilet paper, there's not going to be any left for me. And so we've had this continuing cycle to where everyone's trying to hoard, and they're trying to stock up because they're all panicked, because fear is just spreading and spreading and spreading, and it's building on itself. And that's what was happening in that boat. That's what was happening You had the initial disciples who were afraid, the ones who are inexperienced. That fear spreads to the experienced ones. That reverberates back onto the ones who are inexperienced, and it just keeps going back and forth as fear grows and grows and grows and grows until they reach a point where it's kind of a breaking point for them. And yet, intriguingly here, we see an amazing sight. We see that Jesus is asleep. He's asleep in the boat, which to a point is understandable. I mean, Jesus maintained, if you begin to really get in and study how he acted and how he lived in his regular life, it's very understandable that his work schedule was very, 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 very intense. Jesus would get up early. He would walk everywhere he went, or at least most of the time he would walk. He would spend hours and hours and hours teaching. He didn't get up and preach a 30-minute sermon. He would spend hours teaching at a single sermon. Prior to that, he would be healing people. Following that, he would be healing people and performing miracles. And people were constantly coming to him from sun up to sundown. And it was a constant stream of work and of effort. And so when the opportunity came to sleep, it's understandable that Jesus is easily and quickly able to go to sleep. What is amazing to me is you have this wind that is coming through, it's whipping through, it's roaring, it's loud, it's knocking everything around. The waves, they're growing in intensity until what we're told here is that the boat was already being swamped. In other words, the waves were getting so high that they were coming up and over the side of the boat. Water was coming in over the side from the Sea of Galilee into the boat, and that doesn't even wake Jesus up. The noise, nothing else. I'm a light sleeper. This does not compute with me. Little sound wakes me up at night, and yet here's Jesus. He's getting splashed in the face by water, and that doesn't bother to wake him up. And yet the disciples who have reached their breaking point, they all think that they're going to die. Not just the inexperienced ones, but the lifelong fishermen, they think that they are all going to die. So what do? They go to Jesus. They say, Jesus, wake up. Don't you have enough dignity to at least wake up and face death with the rest of us? That's really what the question is. It's not, they're not asking Jesus to do something. They don't think that he can. They don't understand that he has the ability to do something. They're just upset that Jesus is asleep and he's going to die sleeping with the rest of them. And yet in this, we see a wonderful aspect about the nature of God. Because Jesus, of course, is God in the flesh. And it's this wonderful point that God is never panicked. He's never afraid. He's never caught off guard. See, in his nature, God is all-knowing. He is omniscient. The very nature of that word literally means that all knowledge belongs to God. Not just the knowledge of the Word of God, but all knowledge, period, of past, present, future, of everything that is going on, everything that will happen, everything that has happened. He possesses every truth that exists within the universe itself. In terms of science and mathematics, God possesses that knowledge. It belongs to him. And as such, he's not surprised by anything that happens. He can't be. We as human beings, we become very reactionary. Something happens, an unexpected event happens, and we feel the need to react to it and to try and fix it. God is not reactionary. God is already aware. God works in advance of anything that's going to happen, and therefore everything that does happen happens within his plan or purpose. He's not caught off guard. We get caught off guard because we have very limited control in our life and in our world and with the circumstances that come through. We don't understand. God already knows. Jesus knew before they ever set out that storm was going to come up. He knew exactly the events that were going to play out. He wasn't afraid because he saw no need to be afraid. He knew about it in advance. In addition to that, he had the power to deal with it. He knew what his purpose was. He knew what the plan was. He knew that the plan was going to take him to Calvary's cross, and he was not going to be killed by some storm that night. By the way, it's interesting to note that he had told the disciples exactly what was going to happen. He said, let's go to the other side. He knew in advance that they were going to make it across the sea. But here's where you come into the gap that existed between Christ and the disciples. The disciples, at this point in time, they didn't understand who Christ really is. In fact, the very question that they ask there in verse 41, who then is this? They didn't know who Jesus was. They didn't understand who this person was in the boat with them. That's why the fear was so great. They didn't know who was in the boat with them. By the way, it's important to note that there were a lot of other little boats and little ships out there. Some of them were people who were following Jesus. Some were just fishermen. They were all being affected by the storm. That's going to be a point that we're going to expound upon later. But the disciples had Jesus in the boat with them. But they didn't understand who he was. They thought at this point in time that he's a teacher. In fact, that's the term that they reference him. Teacher, rabbi. They saw him as being a great teacher. They may have thought of him even as the Messiah, but they didn't understand what that incorporated and what that really meant. And this is the reason why they were so afraid. And this is why Jesus rebukes them. You see, Jesus gets up and he goes and he rebukes the sea and the wind, the storm that's happening. And here's why this causes such an issue with the disciples, because it's not like there was a gradual slowdown of the wind. It's not like the waves just started getting lower and lower and lower. It's that everything stopped all at once. You went from this raging wind to not a breath of air. You went from waves that were crashing over the side of the boat to a sea that's as still as glass. And because of this, they become very afraid. And Jesus comes back to them and he rebukes them. He says, why are you afraid? Why are you so fearful? You have no faith. It's interesting that this type of fear over what might happen, over the dangers that this world and this life may present to them, that ceases to exist after Jesus is resurrected from the dead. After that first Easter Sunday. That fear doesn't happen anymore. And the reason why is because they get to understand who Jesus is better. And the better we know God, the less we're going to fear. The better we understand who God is, and the better we get to know him, and the more our relationship with him increases, the less we fear. You see, the realization of the disciples was that Jesus was far more than they thought him to be. You know, they thought he was a teacher. They thought he was a rabbi. They thought he was just another person. Yes, maybe he's a prophet, and maybe he's like Elijah before him, or Isaiah, or Ezekiel, one of these other great prophets. The idea that Jesus was more than that never, ever, ever crossed their minds. And so that's why they asked the question. That's why it says in verse 41, and they were terrified. That word terrified there, it's a very interesting word. It's used in the book of Revelation where it talks about the two witnesses who will appear during the end times. And the Bible says that they're going to be killed by Antichrist, and their bodies are going to lay in the streets for 3 days, and that the entire world will see after 3 days, will see them brought back to life, resurrected in real time worldwide, and that the world will be, and it uses the exact same word that gets translated as terrified here. And this is an amazing word, because it creates awe, it creates wonder, it creates this idea of who is this? How great and how amazing and how powerful this individual must be. And the disciples, they proclaim, What kind of a person can do this? What kind of a person can tell the waves to stop and they stop? What kind of a person can tell the wind to stop and it stops like this? And so they're afraid, they're terrified. But you see, if they had this better relationship, that they had a closer relationship with Christ, with the person in the boat, if they really understood who was in the boat with him, then their fear that the world was causing would decrease. See, as my relationship with God begins to increase, I begin to know him better. I begin to understand him better. I begin to get a greater grasp of his nature and of his character. And the more I begin to develop that relationship with him, the less the unknowns in the world impact me. Because I begin to understand that, yes, this is the one who can command the wind and the seas. This is the one who has all knowledge. This is the person who said, I am going to do X, Y, and Z, and that is exactly what's going to happen. And it doesn't matter what anyone says, what anyone thinks, whether we agree with it or whether we disagree with it. It's based upon who he is, not who we are. It's based upon his knowledge and his power, not upon our own. And this world will begin to lose its power to instill fear in me as I draw closer to God, as I begin to understand who is in the boat with me. Yes, I need to have a fear. And it's the same fear that began to be established by the disciples here when it says in verse 41, and they were terrified and asked one another. It is the fear of the Lord. It is this awe. It is this wonder. It is this idea of God is so much bigger, so greater than anything I could possibly imagine. Now in the next message, we're going to actually look at that question about who it is in the boat. Who is God? Because the greater we understand his nature, the greater we understand his personality, his characteristics, the more important that becomes. But that comes not just in reading about it, but it comes in experiencing life with him. But our relationship must grow with him if we are to overcome fear in this life. I don't blame the world for being fearful and for being panicked because they don't know Christ. They don't know who's in the boat. But the more we get to know him, the less fearful we will be concerning what this world has in store for us.